Hi. So, if your first language is not English, but you read a lot of popular Western literature, then there's a high chance that you have picked up one or two translations in your lifetime. I know that I have, because my first language is German, but while I try to read most books in their original English most of the time nowadays, I do still pick up translations from time to time, since there is a lot of books that aren't originally written in English, and obviously I'm only fluent in those two languages, and also because I buy a lot of used books, and sometimes translations are just cheaper. But today we're actually not even talking about translations, at least not when it comes to the plot of the book. But we're going to talk about something else that is very vital to the book, but not essentially inside of the book. We're going to talk about the translation of the book title. The translation of the book title in German is something that I have been very curious and also very mortified by for a long time. There is so many examples of just horrible translations that are in my collection and that I've seen that I just want to go over because I find them curiously fascinating and also just mildly morbid at the same time. And I just want to see what's wrong, and that's what I'm going to explore in this video today. I want to start by mentioning that I do not have a degree in English or German, and I am obviously not a master in any of the two languages, since I am seemingly getting worse at German every day that I'm speaking more English. And if anybody has like a linguistic degree or things that I misinterpreted something in this video, obviously tell me, because I do not want to put out misinformation. This is just my opinion on these books. And secondly, I also think that before I go to roast these book titles, I should probably state what a good book title or book title translation in this case is for me. But obviously, if you don't want to hear my explanation on what I think is a good book title, then you can obviously also just jump to the timestamp I will probably put here and go to my rants about bad book titles. So in my view, there's three good types of translations for book titles. The best case scenario, in my opinion, would obviously be to leave the original title intact. But if you can't do that, then there's also a trend I like that I've seen crop up recently a lot, where they leave the original title and then just add a German subtitle to indicate that you're looking at the German version. I think books like Yesteryear, as well as The Red Winter did this recently. And there's also older books that it does, like Michael Crichton with his book Sphere, that had the subtitle Die Gedanken des Bösen, which means thoughts of evil. And I don't know how well representative that is. I read that book a long time ago, but I still like it better than a total translation of the title. There's also books like Fourth Wing that did this, which got the subtitle Flammen geküsst, which means flame kissed, which does convey that the book is about dragons, so I think it achieves its point, as well as some Omakatsu books like The Hunger, which got the subtitle Die letzte Reise, or The Last Voyage in English, which is fitting since it is about the last voyage of this colony. And yeah, I think that one is very good because I always like when the original title is left intact, and I think that whole trend is getting a lot more movement because of BookTok and just the internationalization of the entire book community, because now there's way more people that just see a book pop up on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram and they want it, and maybe it's in English, but they can still connect to it because the covers are similar and the titles are similar, and maybe you read it in another language, but you still have the same connection to it, and I like to see that. The second best scenario, in my opinion, would be a literal translation. Obviously, that's not always possible, but there are a lot of literal translations that make sense. Examples of that would be something like Moon of the Crusted Snow, which in German got translated to Mond des verhaschten Schnees, which is a literal translation that also doesn't sound bad. And while I do think that the person who designed the German book cover should be put in prison and hacked to pieces for what they did to that book, but the title is nicely translated. Then there's obviously also things like The Summer Hikaru Died, which I don't know what the original Japanese title was, because that obviously had a title before the English release. But for the English title just being translated to German to Der Sommer, in dem Hikaru starb, is a good translation in my opinion. Something like John Langan's The Fisherman being translated to Der Angler, which definitely works. Or something like Amakatsu's The Fervor being translated to Das Fieber, which also is a literal translation. But what about if you cannot do a literal translation? Well, then I would probably like you to do a translation that is still in the spirit of the original. Because sometimes a literal translation just doesn't sound good in German or doesn't make sense in German. Well, there's still the case that you can make a title that is in the spirit of the original book. Case in point, something like The Stepford Wives, which was translated to Die Frauen von Stepford. Well, why would you say is it Die Frauen von Stepford and not Die Ehefrauen von Stepford? Since Ehefrauen is the German word for wives. Well, that sounds kind of stupid. And also, there is the case that Frau, as in woman, gets often used interchangeably in German with the word for wife, which is Ehefrau. So you can use Frau for both woman and wife. And because it is used more often and sounds better than Ehefrau, the title was probably changed to Die Frauen von Stepford and not Die Ehefrauen von Stepford. But it's still in keeping with the style of the Stepford Wives, so I like that one. Also, there's things like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which in German was translated to Es war einmal in Hollywood, since Once Upon a Time in Hollywood would probably be something like Einst vor einer Zeit in Hollywood, but nobody says that, and Once Upon a Time is commonly translated, though even not word by word, to Es war einmal. Then it obviously makes sense to use the German title Es war einmal in Hollywood. So now, not longer holding up with my explanations, why don't we get into the book titles that I actually think are egregiously translated? Starting with the first one, and also probably one of the worst offenders, I think, which is The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum, in German being translated to Evil. This book is a absolute and total failure, in my opinion. So the original title, in my opinion, is kind of genius, since it is somewhat unassuming and quaint, and is therefore in perfect contrast to the horrifying things that actually go on in this book, while also still conveying what happens in the book, since the book is about a girl next door. But also, the girl next door, as a stereotype, is an awfully pornographic stereotype in modern media about, oh my god, there's the girl next door and the boys are all hot at her. And that also is a very horrifying parallel to the things that happen in the book, as well as how the main character of the book feels toward the eponymous girl next door. So I think the title of the book is kind of genius. That's not to say that the American or English version is a full-on amazing book in terms of marketing, because it obviously had a terrible original run, and the cover is just absolutely garbage. And I also don't even want to say that this book is like totally amazing, because in this case I definitely have a certain disconnect between this book as a literary accomplishment and this book as a piece of media that I enjoyed reading, because I did not enjoy reading at all, because it is quite horrific. And so the feelings I have towards this book are very complicated, because it is very good and very disturbing, but I also would never want to read it again, and I did not enjoy my time with it. But that said, the German title is just absolutely horrific, okay? Calling it evil just strips away all the nuance and subtlety and hints at what the book entails that the original had. Evil, obviously, the characters in the book are evil. Obviously, what's going on in this book is evil, but it's so generic. And also this branding as Heine Hardcore, with this kind of half face of a girl being her face like being wrapped in this plastic bag on the cover, it just makes it seem less than it actually is. It makes it seem like it's this, and I don't want to demean that genre, kind of like full brutal extreme horror novel that is only about the scare factor. There is no other thing. It only wants to disturb you. And I do think that is more literary merit to The Girl Next Door than it tries to convey in this German version. So I definitely do not like it. Also, there's the fact that on this cover, it says that it has a afterbird from Stephen King, but the afterbird from Stephen King is actually a foreword that they just put after the book. So, yeah, whoever made the decisions about this book, I absolutely hated. And again, the title is so generic and just loses everything that the original had. I absolutely hate it. Something that I actually hate way less, but I mean, I had to rant for a little bit. And from an author that actually has a few very good translations, as well as titles that were completely left alone, it's Misery by Stephen King, which in German was translated to Sie. So that obviously doesn't make sense in the slightest. Sie is the German pronoun for she, and yeah, that obviously has nothing to do with misery. And here, I just do not really get why they could not have left the original title intact. Obviously, misery in German means something like Elend, but also misery in the original book doesn't mean what the word misery means, but misery is a name of a character in the book. And so I just do not get why they could not just have left the original title there. I also do not get why C was chosen as another title. It's very confusing because there is another Stephen King book with a pronoun as a title. You probably have heard of it. It's It, which in German also was translated to S, the German equivalent. So it now makes it seem like Misery and It are in a series, when while Stephen King's universe is wider connected for sure, the books themselves do not really have any interconnecting stuff in characters, plot, or anything. So I do not get why this was chosen, especially when Stephen King does have a few very good translations. I mean, I just mentioned It, which was literally translated to S, but there's also stuff where they just left the title completely alone, like I would have liked them to do with Misery. That is the case for Desperation, where the German title is also Desperation, which they obviously could have literally translated to Verzweiflung, but they didn't because Desperation is just the name of the town in the book, so renaming that town to a German name wouldn't have made sense, and because it's just a name, it also made sense to put in the German book title. So again, I do not know why they didn't choose this for Misery. There's also the fact that The Stand is called The Stand, das letzte Gefecht, with just the German subtitle being The Last Stand, literally. But yeah, I do like that. He also has translations like The Shining, in German just being called Shining, because The Shining, as the force that Danny possesses in the German book, is also called Shining. They could have probably still called it Das Shining, because we don't have a D in German, we have the gendered version, which is der, die, das. As a non-binary person, don't get me started on how much I hate that, but they probably could have still called it Das Shining, since it's used in that way in the book, but just Shining conveys it, and it still leaves the original title intact, so I pretty much like it. And then there's also like less egregious cases, but still ones that I don't like in his whole bibliography, like what they did to Under the Dome, which in German was translated to Die Arena, which basically means the arena. Yeah, not really much of a difference in English. But yeah, I get it because, yeah, Under the Dome, it basically becomes this arena of good and evil in the way of the book. So it's not that far-fetched of a translation, but a literal translation of Under the Dome to Unter der Kuppel would have still worked and would have not sounded that bad. So I don't know why someone didn't go for that one. So yeah, as in with his output, also the titles of Stephen King's work, especially when translated to German, are also hit or miss. But why don't we now take a look at something else that I dislike? And that is Beartown by Fredrik Backman. Obviously, Beartown is not the book's original title. It was originally called Björnstadt, if I say that right, because it was originally a Swedish book. But the German title is Kleine Stadt der großen Träume, which translates roughly to Little City of Big Dreams. And yeah, I get it, because it is about a small town with big dreams. That still sounds way too cute for what this book actually is and what it deals with. And I really don't get why we don't have a title that is similar to Beartown. Obviously, Beartown, translating it to Bärenstadt, doesn't make sense, because the German copy is not a translation of the English book, but a literal translation from this original Swedish. But in Swedish, it was also called Björnstadt. And if you didn't want to call it Bärenstadt, then, because the town in the book is obviously also called Björnstadt, even in the German book, then why didn't you just keep the original title and call it Björnstadt? It was right there. It's, again, a name. It's not that difficult to understand what it means, that it's the name of a place. Another very egregious example, and one that I kind of hate, is One by One by Ruth Ware, which in German was translated to Das Chalet, mit dem Schnee kommt der Tod. That in English means the chalet, with the snow comes death. That obviously is the furthest thing from One by One. And like, it's not that One by One is a stupid title. I do not want to pretend that there is some crazy literary merit behind there, like I already did for Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door. But One by One obviously pertains to the mystery trope of characters being picked off one by one, which does happen in the book. And it's not that One by One is unheard of to be translated to German. There is a literal German translation in Eine nach dem anderen, or Einer nach dem anderen, because again, we have to gender everything here. I hate it. So why didn't you just do that? I know it sounds generic, but Das Chalet mit dem Schnee kommt der Tod just sounds plain corny. And a lot of German titles sound corny, even when the translation is kind of good. Like with Amazonia by James Rollins being translated to Operation Amazonas, which in English would mean Operation Amazonia, which does make it sound like a more generic military thriller than it actually is. But then again, everything that is slightly horror or thriller, basically in German publishing for a long time just got lumped together and published as generic military thrillers or just generic domestic thrillers. It was all one and the same thing, no matter if it was like a more experimental thriller, a more sci-fi thriller, or even an outright horror book. It was all under one thing. So yeah, I do get it, but like, why? Why do we have to make it sound corny and generic? Like, what the hell? One translation that I also hate, and that actually stems from a kind of good translation, is Relic by Douglas Preston, in German translated to Relic, Museum der Angst, which is Relic, Museum of Fear. Makes sense, because again, the book takes place in a museum, and the people definitely fear something in that museum, so it does make sense. But that good, well-translated original title then was continued into a series of books where the German publisher basically thought that to really make sure that everybody knew that this was a series, instead of just like name recognition, people looking it up, the characters being the same, they had to make all the titles similar. So where the next book in the English series was Reliquary, in Germany we got Attic, Grauen aus der Tiefe. So obviously, it somewhat makes sense, since there is a location in the book called Devil's Attic that is under New York, and there is something very terrible there. So the thing Attic coming from the deep, aus der Tiefe, it makes sense. But why didn't you just go with a translation of Reliquary? I do not know what Reliquary translated means. My English is not that good. But I see what they want to do here, and it continues through the entire Pendergast series, where now every title is an English word with a German subtitle. And the thing is, with the fourth book, for example, which I also looked at, it's Still Life with Crows in English, and in German it's Ritual Höhle des Grauens, which basically means ritual cave of doom, or cave of fear, cave of something. Like, it's definitely like fitting, but also it kind of spoils the book, because I have not read Still Life with Crows that far. And I do actually own a English copy of Still Life with Crows, but that's not the point. But Still Life with Crows, nowhere in the synopsis or anything says that it is about a cave. But now the German title spilled out for me that there is a cave with probably a ritual happening in it. So thank you. I get what you're doing, and that you want to brand the entire series that way, but I still kind of despise it, okay? I really do. And again, I do not want to say that I have like a lot of better suggestions for any of the naming conventions of these books. Like The Girl Next Door, going back to what I started this video with, and at least in terms of the terrible book names that I disliked, this book, calling it Das Nachbarsmädchen, would sound terribly old-timey. But calling it Die Nachbarin, which would basically both work for The Girl Next Door, or maybe in case of Die Nachbarin also The Woman Next Door, but it still kind of fits. Die Nachbarin sounds too adult, while Das Nachbarsmädchen sounds too old-timey. So I get the dilemma. But again, I am not like a professional like writer. And obviously it's like not a writer, but like a translator. And I also don't want to put this on the translators, because I do not think that it's their fault. I think the title is probably a thing that the publishing house is taking on. So I'm gonna blame the publishing houses, I guess. But still, like, just do better. Like, I dislike these. And maybe as nonsensical as this video seems, like, I just dislike it. Also, I haven't even touched on that, but like, calling the German book evil. Again, I am so like focused on that one book. But why would you then not just take another English title? Like The Girl Next Door? Like the original thing? Because like, this is a plague that is plaguing a lot of German media, where they don't want to keep the original English title, but then they replace it with another English title. That is something I've seen a lot in movies, and while I'm currently blanking on a lot of older examples that I've harped on in private, I do remember some recent ones with sinners not being called sinners, but blood and sinners for some reason, and The Watchers, which is also based on the book The Watchers by A.M. Shine, now suddenly being called They See You. Again, other English titles. Why did you not just keep the originals? I do not get it. So if any of you have like insight or have like resources that would explain to me how like titles are chosen, how they come together, I would definitely be interested in that. And if you have any like own gripes with titles, like tell me, because I would definitely like to look at it. This is a very similar thing to book covers for me, because I've seen so many people harp on like, oh my god, look at this terrible version of a cover I found. Like I've seen one girl on TikTok like do it where there's like some terrible, I think like Eastern European version of Twilight that literally had like a kid's drawing of a dog on a cover. I swear. I probably won't find it again, but like for me the titles is similar. I've done a video on book covers I hate too, but that one is probably not as good. I don't think this is good either. Like, do not get me wrong. And because I'm getting rambly, you probably know that we're getting to the end of the video. But yeah, definitely let me know if you have similar gripes about titles, and if you have any knowledge about how they come together, then I would definitely want to know as well. And if you enjoyed this video, then maybe give me a follow and leave this video a like or a comment. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you in a video. Bye!